I'd like to welcome you all to Indiana University and the Hamilton Luber School of Global International Studies for this installment of Think Globally, Eat Here, Local Solutions for Global Problems series. We live in an increasingly interconnected world, but what we do locally has a great effect, and we are asking questions about what can we do locally in our communities, in local institutions, and as individuals to advance our interests and needs. For the last 3 years, the Ostrom Workshop and the Hamilton Luber School have co-sponsored this series, which this year focuses on local solutions to global problems. I would like to introduce one of the organizers of the series, Doc Service.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. We've all lived through disasters. We have one going on right now because we're on a different Zoom than the one that was on our page for this that we've been promoting for some time. So hopefully word's getting out to some people. We have a few coming in now. But we're all either 1 or 2 degrees away from somebody who's experienced a disaster. Joyce is from Los Angeles. We can't count how many people we know or know people who know are now homeless. And we know Kevin and Rosalie, who are from Swannanoa, North Carolina, and their house is gone from the Hurricane Helene tragedy, which struck there and is still going on. But what Kevin and Rosalie are very good at doing is not just recovery, which is what everybody's talking about, but regeneration. What can we do to make this place better, perhaps, even than it was before? So I'm going to hand this over to Kevin. Let him take it from here. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you all for inviting me here to speak today. It's really great to be in a session where people whose books I've read and Substacks I follow have already spoken, and I'm glad to be here. Now, when I speak, I sometimes use some finger puppets that kind of spur some creativity. And so today, I have Ganesh, the god of good luck. See it up there. And I often take, Sojourner Truth often wants to come along just to remind me that, everybody is somebody. And, but there was because I talk so much about Elinor Ostrom, my daughter thought that I was missing something. And so she made an Elinor Ostrom finger puppet that I bring with me, obviously to here, but also to other places. She's spoken with me at a UN gathering in Armenia. And so it's kind of wild that I've been invited to the Ostrom sessions. So we used Ostrom's approach in creating SOCAP, which became the largest impact investing conference. Now, as I'm sure you all know if you know her work, ranchers can manage a watershed 43% better than government can if they get all the voices at the table and they listen and they go and seek out the folks who are not speaking but who are downstream. And so we followed those principles for listening to all the voices in the community. And what that meant to us at SOCAP was that as we scheduled speakers, we knew that the voices that could best impact the future were from the communities that were in need of investment around economic injustice. They had more answers than the powerful foundations and aid agencies and impact investors who had plans to impose their solutions and theories of change on those communities and often had not taken the time to listen to what those communities really want. We see the same thing at Neighborhood Economics, our conferences now. Too many times, well-meaning philanthropists, city governments, and people of faith want to come in and apply their ideas about what the neighborhood needs when the answers are already there in the neighborhoods. I've come to see over and over that listening to the impacted community is the key to our collective survival. And in this era of catastrophic destruction through climate change, it hurts the most vulnerable and poorest communities first. I believe that's why when Hurricane Helene hit, I was quick to see the commons arising around us. And I'm now getting to work on a project I never could have imagined, trying to keep alive the commons where all are welcome and all are cared for. There's a fairly large group of us working to build the infrastructure that we hope might keep the reciprocity in relationships flowing in this post-disaster economy. On the morning of September 27th, we evacuated around 7 a.m., right after we got the text telling us that now was a mandatory time evacuation. We could see the water rising. It was already 3 or 4 feet higher than it had ever been before. And then we had to move quickly because the gentle Swannanoa River that we'd lived next to for 15 years was raging and coming after us. My wife and I live on a farm, our kids and grandsons right next door in the southern Appalachian town of Asheville. The economy revolves around the $3 billion tourism industry, anchored by the Biltmore Mansion, built by the Vanderbilts, and it's still the largest private home 135 years later in the country. We drove up a hill across the interstate that we believed was going to be free of the flood, but also free of falling trees and power lines. We'd never experienced real flooding like this. There'd not been a flood like this where we live in the past 200 years. There'd been about 3 or 4 floods at the farm, but none had come close to breaching the 4-foot berm between us and the river. We live about 100 feet from the river, half in the floodplain and half in the floodway. The line runs through our house. Now, it was built several years ago, and you couldn't site it there today. It was built there before FEMA set the rules. And we were one of the few homeowners with flood insurance. It was a requirement for our mortgage. And the last payment on the mortgage is due in November of this year. If the hurricane had hit in January of 2026, we might not have had flood insurance. There had never been a need for it. And we'd never seen anything like this flood. There are acres of fields around the farm that are lower than we are, and we didn't see any danger of flooding. The Swannanoa was a beautiful, gentle, tree-lined river, a park visible across the way we could usually wade to, and we had glamping sites, rows of gardens, and conversation pits set up in several places along the way. We used to have a website, 15riparianway.org, that showed our retreat center. We took it down because now we have sand dunes where there were all those glamping sites, crops, farms, and places to sit and talk. In the days following September 27th, our low-status, unincorporated rural community, Swannanoa, whose name in the community, in the county, is Swannanowhere, was 5 times on the front page of the New York Times, twice in the Washington Post. And Trump did an intrusive campaign stop there, and he was also there last week. Our devastation is more visible than any other place that the hurricane hit. And we're also, all the weather folks say that we were the epicenter. There's a line that just stops in Swannanoa. And so Swannanoa was knocked flat, and the overwhelming devastation means that photo ops abound. When people come and they want to see the devastation, they drive out to Swannanoa. And because we were largely ignored by the county, Swannanowhere built a more robust set of mutual aid networks to care for each other than any place in our county. Neighborhoods in the 4 municipalities got emergency water. Unincorporated areas with more social and political capital got water. We did not get emergency water distribution that other communities got. We are Swannanowhere. The county had been telling us for more than a year they want to get rid of our public library, and it's the only place for people to gather in public. After Helene, the post office took away the mobile post office they put up after the hurricane without telling anybody. The disenfranchisement of Swannanoa is standard operating procedure. To gain a voice in the corridors of power, we formed a local advocacy group, because sometimes you can't just stand together. You have to stand up and speak truth to power. With no meaningful government presence, the community had and was free to provide for ourselves. As Rebecca Solnit says in her book, Paradise Built in Hell, the prevalent human nature in a disaster is resilient. It's resourceful. It's generous. It's empathic. and it's brave. And we stepped up, and people loved the non-cash economy that almost instantly emerged. People could receive things even while the recovery was slow and hard, as we ate free meals together at Blunt Pretzel. It's a small shop that was one of the few occupied buildings and thriving businesses in Swannanoa's decayed downtown. Swannanoa had been a factory town during World War II, making blankets. After the factory burned down, all the businesses decayed and the factory closed, and the company town slowly deteriorated. Almost 2 miles away, we lived across the river from a county park in a less developed part of Swannanoa, and the river raged through us all. We spent the first night of the 27th in an Airbnb we own on the other side of the farm on slightly higher ground and are living there now. Our Airbnb guest had gotten the evacuation notice, but they left us a really well-stocked supply of drinks and snacks. So we discovered a neighbor a quarter mile away that had a solar generator tied to a well, and we can get 5 gallons, two 5-gallon jugs of water a day. We shared a Starlink. I had a friend who knew the way through the mountains and brought 3 generators, one for us and one for 2 neighbors. So we were set for the short term. And, but it was those days before we were able to even get back, 3 days before we were able even to get back to our house, with the help of the search and rescue and restoration teams paid by FEMA and a few generous neighbors. We got in, but the trucks and cars and even buildings that had flooded there still remain to this day. The devastation was more than any of us had seen, and it was more than we can imagine. That's the same thing people are saying in LA or about the fires, or they said a few weeks ago about the typhoon in Marti in the Indian Ocean. Your story of place breaks in these disasters. Geologic change in the mountains, thousands of homes lost in LA, a whole island devastated. We had no electricity for 2 weeks. We didn't have water for 3 weeks and had potable water 5 weeks later. Little and erratic cell service, no commercial internet for 2.5 weeks. The places where climate change is landing, the abrupt transformation breaks the local imagination. The place you called home, the comforts of home, is bewilderingly unrecognizable. While the video is stunning to see on TV or online, the local incomprehensibility of climate change is new. We did have each other, but the place we knew was not the same place, even though we lived there. A commons had arisen around us, and we realized there was enough if we could share it. A new economy was in operation where commodification of people and materials was not the first option, where rescue was what people were trying to do. And survival for all of us was an interdependent reality. I had a friend who said, it's sad that it took a disaster to make this transformation happen. And I said, I've lived through it, and I think only in this disaster are you ready to change everything, when you realize the whole system is wrong and it's not working for you. And you're open to the fact that it's not working for everybody, even the people that you hadn't counted before. So all the manifest ways the system is broken, you can realize that something really new and completely different than what had existed is possible. It's possible in the disaster in a way it's not possible when everything is broken. A massive localized disaster can play the same role that a death in the family might in a family system. Rabbi Ed Friedman, who used the family systems approach to guide system change in congregations and the Pentagon and corporations, said death disrupts the family existing dynamics, making long-standing dysfunctional patterns more visible, creating a new space to reevaluate and change behaviors that were unjust and unhealthy. The disaster, like the death of an oppressive family patriarch, for example, can open the door to shifting the system. That's the hope I see embedded in climate change disasters. we can discover how to live together and keep ourselves safer. Collective bioregional climate change response happens after the deadly fact has happened, when we know we are all in it together and we need each other to survive. Collective bioregional climate change response is possible post-disaster in a way it was not before. Now, I was barely involved in my local community before Helene. Now I'm immersed in it. I started reading books about how people respond to disaster and what made some people survive and some people become victims. The best context I've seen was provided by Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell. She looked at accounts of disasters from explosions in Halifax in the early 19th century, the first one where the sociology of survival was studied, and more recently through our own experience of Katrina and the 1989 earthquake in California. The other key book for me is The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley. Solnit's the one that described our reality the best, but Ripley, researching the mindset of the people who survive disasters and the people who become victims is also significant. The first edition of her books only looked at 9/11. She updated it post-COVID, and she concluded that lack of trust will kill more people than the disaster itself. Solnit says, horrible in itself, disaster is sometimes a door back into paradise, the paradise at least in which we are who we hope to be. Solnit says disasters throw us into temporary utopias of a transformed human nature and society, one that is bolder, freer, less attached and divided than in ordinary times. In the disruptive power of disaster, what matters there is the ability of disasters to topple old orders and open new possibilities. Resilient resourcefulness represents the ordinary response to many disasters. In them, strangers become friends and collaborators. Goods are shared freely. People improvise new roles for themselves. Usually, Solnit says, these utopias are by their very nature unsustainable and vanish like a lightning flash. But sometimes it illuminates ordinary life, and the lightning, like it can, sometimes breaks the old forms. You're suddenly in a society where money plays little or no role, where people rescue each other, and they care for each other, and food is given away, where the old divides between people seem to have fallen away, and the faith that faces them is shared. Now, my passionate goal is to build the ligatures and sinews and protocols for transformation of an economy based on reciprocity and connection, but keep the elements of the commons alive and part of our normal life post-disaster. For more than a decade, I've been working to help marginalized communities thrive through innovative financing that brings economic power to the folks who don't usually have it. Through our conferences, first SOCAP, which became the largest impact investing conference in the world, 3,500 people from 65 countries the year we sold it, and later Neighborhood Economics, which we've been gathering for a decade now, and will convene this year in Asheville, April 1st and 2nd. My wife and business partner, Rosalie Harden, have made our ideas become reality. We've succeeded 8 times, and our businesses have become the dominant player in the local market. I tried one time without her, and it failed. So I don't do that anymore. Together, we have succeeded repeatedly, but I've never experienced anything like the momentum and widespread welcoming adoption I have seen since the river rose and took so much away from all of us. Now, in a place where the effort to keep the library from being taken away had lost momentum, where the community effort to bring us sidewalks has petered out, suddenly Swannanoa has become deeply self-aware, and it's a place filled with active neighbors, working to build back not just better, but in a new way that strengthens these new relationships while commerce struggles to come back to life. This new economy does not emerge due to a manifesto and top-down campaign to change the system. It's emerging from a growing handful of initiatives that create relationships and reciprocity rather than a scheme to extract wealth for yourself from those communities. The new economy can find room to breathe in the commons that arises after a disaster reveals how much is broken. I believe I was uniquely prepared, oddly in a way, to thrive in the wake of this disaster in the mountains of the most diverse part of North America. After growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I began my career as a weekly journalist in what was then the poorest county in Mississippi, working under the leadership of my father-in-law, who realized that in that arid economic environment, he had to build a community where his business could survive. My mother-in-law also coalesced the community to create the first public library in that red dirt poor community. A group of us created an arts council and arts festival that's still going after 40 years. Rosalie grew up with the idea, my wife Rosalie, creating the infrastructure that builds community. So it was natural to her, and it became natural to me. It was there in Itawamba County, Mississippi, that I found my intuitive methodology that has served me well as a reporter and led me to be a successful serial entrepreneur. It's got 3 things I do: wander around, figure things out, make things happen. After September 27th, I became the reporter from Swannanoa post-Helene, but one who had experience in galvanizing collaborative initiatives to build lasting infrastructure in barren, resource-constrained places. I was perhaps rather uniquely ready to be effective in this moment. My blog for the last dozen years has been building an interdependent economy and walking away from the myth of the rugged individual. Destruction from Hurricane Helene is making both of those things happen. Devastation has to be seen to be believed, and even after you've seen it, it's hard to comprehend. 2 parcels down from us, the river moved 100 yards to the north. At a bend in the river pre-September 27th, the engineers had put a lot of riprap to protect the land at that bend. Well, the river has moved 100 yards, and there's a gravel and sand beach where the river is, and there's just a tiny little stream where the river was. It's a geologic event, as they say. And so for months after, the 4 months after, the debris is still everywhere. And they say it will take another 6 years to remove. So chaos, not order, is the main feature of the landscape. That's why people come to look at Swannanoa. You can see and feel the devastation in Swannanoa. But beyond the incomprehensible devastation and the hard to describe difficulty of daily life, everybody I asked was also clear in those first few months that they loved this new reality we were living in. We had all things in common. We ate twice a day at Blunt Pretzel. Eddie Schaffmeyer's pretzel making business, that was where the tables were set up, and that we were fed by World Central Kitchen, a nonprofit that is now highly active in Los Angeles as well. My epiphany came when I was sharing a picnic table with 2 fundamentalist preachers, and they were talking about the hand of God in all this, and they waited for a pause, and I said, would you rather go back to the economy before September 27th or now? And they said, this is far better. This feels great. They didn't have words for it, but they knew the life they were living, the economy they were part of, was better than they had been. So we were in a new economy where what I dubbed the disaster protocols were operating. That's where abundance is the foundational assumption, and there is enough for all if we share it. The thinking that leads to privatizing our public resources was recognized as a dangerous fallacy. Economic privatization would not be possible if we had not forgotten that we are our brother's keepers. In Disaster, Solnit says the constellation of solidarity, altruism, and improvisation that are within most of us reappear. A society where money plays little or no role, where people rescue each other and then care for each other, emerges naturally. Because even the richest neighbor lacked potable water on their estate. It was okay at Blunt Pretzel to admit that you were in need. Rugged individuals who in normal situations would be, displaying their status differentiation, lived into an interdependent economy when they needed help. There was no water in their gated communities, and they had to come out and get help, just like everyone else. Because the county could not find us a way to get water, World Central Kitchen erected a tank and came throughout the day. People came throughout the day to get 2 5-gallon jugs filled. According to Solnit, these utopias almost always arise after a disaster. People care for each other and share what they have and often volunteer tirelessly. And when everybody can eat at home and has water and power restored, life goes back to normal. My property goes back to being my property. People go back to living behind their fences. People remember these great times, how they felt, how we talked to strangers at Blunt Pretzel. We never would have known before. And times were and still hard. We have no grocery store in Swannanoa, no hardware store, no post office. The 2 good restaurants are gone. Even the Burger King is gone. And tourism revenue for the county, which is what our economy is based on, was down 70% in the 4th quarter. But both FEMA and Red Cross have said that they have never seen such organized and efficient post-disaster mutual aid networks where relationships are central and egos are minimized as we have. As government has failed, it's been mutual aid, this process of neighbors who met their neighbors after the hurricane, who have stepped in again and again to make life livable. We've come to expect it. No one is coming to save us. What we have is us. And our big, bold ideas about the commons are getting traction like never before. Disasters, Solnit says, sometimes create an opening to build something along the lines of the way people actually want to live. Rosalie and I and our team have been gathering catalytic investors to our neighborhood economics conferences and the creative, system-shifting entrepreneurs with solutions that create intergenerational wealth in neighborhoods where they don't have assets. We've held neighborhood economics in several cities and have decided to hold a small one in Asheville this past November. Helene made sure that didn't happen. But we are gathering those national innovators in a couple of months, the first 2 days in April in Asheville. And we'll be highlighting a new theme, neighborhood scale resilience. Our events work because we have a methodology different from our competitors. The method of matchmaking is relevant to the commons we're trying to nurture and safeguard in Swannanoa. All the other impact investing conferences tried to get the right people in the room. We focused on the valuable strangers that the other people who were just looking for the right people would likely not discover. The voices of groups invisible to the conveners looking for the right people. Now, this bringing of voices that were invisible to the table serves to create unlikely allies which can together do unexpected things. The right people don't think about doing unexpected things. They've been MBAs and they know what they think they're doing. These matchmaking skills that we've used to build the content for conferences for 30 years are actually, it turns out, even more valuable when we're doing it where we live. The question is not what's your status, but how you're showing up as an ally for neighbors you've come to know since the disaster that engulfed us all. We are working with partners and stakeholders to keep that ethos of working within a framework of reciprocity versus extraction in what we're building. I think the overall narrative of what we're building is best served by describing just a couple of the initiatives that are sprouted post-Helene. These could lead to a localized economy based on reciprocity rather than commodification, and that recognizes the common good that includes everybody. Let's start with World Central Kitchen. They were a godsend all over the region. They brought us water when the local governments ignored Swannanoa. And they're still providing the ingredients to the free meals created by Blunt Pretzel that you can get every evening. But they source from traditional sources like Cisco that probably does the cafeteria here. This sourcing has been a disaster for local growers. We have a strong farm-to-table economy that was hurt even worse because the restaurants who usually serve their food were closed, the farmers' markets were closed, and their farms damaged. And with World Central Kitchen, their food didn't get to anybody. The big buyer was buying from Cisco rather than local. So a visionary Red Cross exec, I've never heard of such a thing, but they're great, and we have one, has given $1 million to Mother Earth Foods, our local farm-to-table distributor, to create a replicable model for World Central Kitchen, the next disaster, to source from local growers rather than disempowering local growers while everyone loves them. The hurricane also provided a major initiative to bring our core economic justice work forward. Bountiful Cities is a network of urban gardens in Asheville. The network manager has come up with a plan to create food security linked with climate resilience that also includes reparations. Based in the community gardens in the 5 red line neighborhoods that suffered urban renewal, the plan is to set up modular hydroponics units that can go to where the people are sheltering. I've found that people who only express a mild interest in, for example, my local project, the Community Equity Fund, which solves the problem of friends and family funding for the 90% of black businesses that never grow past the 4th employee, they aren't interested in that. But when I mention food security, they ask more questions. They're interested. The food security plan that is also climate resilient might also work in the affluent neighborhoods. Both of the initiatives for the growers and in the garden network want to use a tool we have created with Impact Assets, a $3.6 billion donor advised fund platform that's called the Common Sense Fund. And it's the most accessible grassroots philanthropic investment vehicle out there. Groups who can raise just $5,000 can create an evergreen revolving investment fund based in their community garden or their Sunday school class or an 8th grade environmental science class. You give, you get the deduction, the gift goes out as patient, catalytic, early stage capital willing to be flexible and take a risk. And then that gift comes back to your garden or your 8th grade class's donor advised fund to give again. No one's ever made a tool that reaches that far down and makes it easy for people it takes 20 people to raise $5,000. And both the garden and the growers are excited about that grassroots level because they have grassroots people who care. Large donors, foundations and the public sector, like to come alongside initiatives started by the community like that. So they're expressing interest in this coming alongside and scaling it. We are in the phase of uncoordinated innovation in an opening created by the disaster. And not every initiative is likely to succeed. But the evidence that the system is broken is creating new opportunities for people to think about new ways because they realize that the economy we were in before the hurricane didn't really work for everyone. And they've learned that everyone is their neighbor. And the people who do want to find ways to have more of what we had in that time when we held everything in common. Now, there's another thing that's changed. I mentioned all the times that we were on the front page of the New York Times, that Trump uses us as a photo op. And that's Swannanoa will be getting a lot of money coming in. A major regional environmental nonprofit is now going to focus its fundraising on Swannanoa because it has become nationally known as the hardest hit place in the most devastating hurricane to hit the country. And you can see the devastation. When you couple that with this suddenly fertile ground for innovations that truly change the system, then there's really no telling what might happen in Swannanoa. It is the destructive power of the hurricane that has opened up a window of opportunity for the innovators who have the vision to build their part of the new system, an economy, a culture rooted in our common welfare. It's not enough just to stand together. You have to stand up when it's not working. Swannanoa Grassroots Alliance, the mutual aid network that has become our umbrella group, met for an hour and a half with the governor 2 weeks ago. And then suddenly, when FEMA last week said that they were going to get rid of all the vouchers, and there are hundreds, probably still about close to 1,000 people in hotels, the governor made that go away, and the vouchers were back by Thursday. As I'm watching all of these together, more and more innovations emerging. With the rapidly increasing climate disasters, it seems to me that the opportunity is arising to build durable innovations that can expand in place and replicate as small pieces loosely joined. I'm willing to bet that this can be the spark to build the things that are needed locally to maintain the evanescent utopias that arise in a collective disaster. We will survive climate change if we use the opening of the post-disaster utopia to build a locally focused economy rooted in the common good that works for us all across race, class, and zip code. The work is hard and long, but the disasters create an opening for the new economy that works for us all. When everything is broken, you can build what you really wanted all along. Thank you.
So are there any questions here? I'll also ask people online. I don't know if you can hear me, but you should be audible online if you keep your mic off. Or raise your hand. Yeah. So we have the second mic here. Any questions? Any questions in the room? Okay, I've got one. It sounds to me like there ought to be some sort of kit that is, in case of fire, break glass, like it used to say in schools everywhere. It seems to me you're putting together something like that right now. Is that the case?
Is there a kit that works in disasters? There is a group called Resilience Force that is coming to town. And Saket Soni, who leads that group, has been working in disasters for 19 years. And he creates the workforce that is needed right now, actually. And they are the folks who will repair houses when the volunteers have to go back to work. And so he works with undocumented and underemployed people to do that work. He's also in New Orleans created a thing called the Resilience Corps. And there are all these volunteers that we're working with and connecting to they've discovered this is what they should have been doing all along. And he helps them professionalize and become case managers and tie them into the existing funding structure. So we're going to work with him on that. But nobody's done innovative finance in a disaster that I've seen before.
You mentioned somebody from the Red Cross who had an epiphany and tell us more about that, because I couldn't hear all of it, and it sounded...
Well, a lot of times the Red Cross gives you boxes. I grew up poor, we got Red Cross boxes. It was a terrible line to be in. But they realized the system was broken. They listened to someone who could do something more in the system, the really trusted distributor for the local farmers, the farm-to-table farmers. And they realized that World Central Kitchen, that was everybody's hero, was destroying local farmers. And so they were willing to give $1 million to say, let's create a replicable module that works there. There's also a thing called resilience centers that we're creating in a former Methodist church. And it'll be the third place. If they take away our library, we will have the Resilience Center. I mean, the county still is not on our side. So we might lose that only public place, but we'll have the former Methodist church is a better public place. So there are things like resilience centers. And people who are looking to create new systems are doing things. We're creating a currency that I think is really pretty interesting. The local college, Warren Wilson, is one of two rural work colleges, Berea in Kentucky and Warren Wilson, 1,000 acres of food forest. And they actively restore the river. They've been working, the Swannanoa had been what's called an impaired river. And there was too much effluent. And so they've been working with the town of Black Mountain to create swales and design swales for when they had enough money to keep the runoff from happening. They've been doing rain gardens. And so, in fact, September 27th, they had planned something they were calling the Swannanoa River Revival. And they were going to bring back a tangerine darter that is one of these fish that makes the water healthier, eats the bad stuff. And we were planning, so we discovered that on our farm, two things. One is that we were the site of launching the first massacre. and that we were also the site of a village that was the ancestor
First massacre of Cherokee.
of Cherokees, right.
Yeah.
One white man was killed, and then they went down and killed the band of Cherokees, 1 to 35. And it never been noticed by the historian. So I was doing a disaster memorial, massacre memorial with the Two-Spirit Cherokee, and I was going to tell the story of what the white folks were thinking, and he was going to tell the Cherokee story. And and that was scheduled the day of the hurricane, so it's still on the table. But and we're going to work with the Cherokee who don't have enough river cane, because these are the folks who hid up in the hills from Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. And so they don't own bottomland, and so they don't have enough supply of the river cane, and they have double weave baskets that can hold water.
And river cane is the bamboo-like.
River cane is the bamboo-like
It goes along
thing,
the
yeah.
rivers and you weave baskets out of it.
Yeah, and where we had row crops and gardens and glamping, there's now sand dunes. The thing that restores sand dunes to being soil is river cane. It's the first filter. It plays the same role as mangroves and other things like that. So we're working with the Cherokee to bring back the river cane. So, but the currency is going to be based on the health of the river. And so they know how to make the river healthy, and so we want all these initiatives to say, are you making the river healthier? So we have an uber goal, because if the river is healthier, then your land won't be washed away.
So the currency is issued by who and takes what form?
It'll be issued by Warren Wilson and their students.
Warren Wilson, okay. And Warren Wilson is this work practice college. It's where
Yeah,
you're,
right,
you're,
exactly.
You're
That's
working
1,000
on the farm
acres.
and you're learning.
Right.
Yeah.
A really cutting edge environmental science and now climate masters there. But I mean, so if we're building a new system, a new currency gives you kind of a place to put the storyboard of what it looks like and make sure that it's a value marker. You know, does this make the river healthier? One other thing that this relates to is that everybody's home is at risk now because our land was scoured. And what that means is all the mycelial stuff, the microbes, everything in the soil that held your soil, that made your house safe, is gone. What we have are rocks, gravel, and dirt. Things aren't living in our soil. So we're working actively in bioremediation. But if the river is not healthy, your house is not safe. The houses uphill on the mountains are not safe. We've lost 30% of our trees that one day. So river health means making the land up where the rich folks live safer, and because they won't run down on the folks who mostly live down low are the poor folks. So you have to make it so that their rocks don't come down on you. So river health is the way we will survive the winters.
Yes.
So, Kevin, I have an idea,
Yeah.
a question about if you could tell us about how technology was applied early on. I mean, how did the local people respond to the fact that you had no water, you had no electricity, you had
Yeah.
whatever? How did you communicate with the outside world?
You know, communicating with the outside world was not what we were doing. Actually, Facebook, for all its flaws, was an extremely effective communication vehicle. We would have multiple Swannanoa groups. We had a group that was focused on propane heaters because when there was no electricity, propane was the answer, getting propane in. And then in the winter, there are different groups that were focused on getting campers in. People were donating campers from all over the country, and people are living, they're not in tents, they're in campers, which is, everybody's saying that's a victory. Well, you know, they lived in a house or they lived in an apartment, and a camper is better than a tent. So Facebook was incredibly useful. Now we're moving to WhatsApp with more things, but actually you could ignore all the politics. And one of the things that was really interesting, I was working with a woman, God's Church of Asheville, and I looked on her site and her page, and it was more MAGA than ever. And she said, "Don't trust FEMA." And I said, "I'm working with FEMA." But we became effective coordinating disaster relief into her neighborhood, and she invited me into her conservative Christian group because I was helping know where the resources should go. So we got over ourselves. Facebook worked really well because you could do almost anything with it. That's, you know, there were GPS studies that showed how bad it was, but it was really, you know, Starlink was an amazing gift. And so we were doing Starlink and microgrids, and we were part of a fundraiser. So microgrids are solar arrays that do collection that brought power to places, you know, where they weren't. So we helped that get a lot of places. We are the most biodiverse place, and I'm going to talk about why that's true and why we were particularly hurt by this hurricane. Alabama has 2 kinds of the snail darters, and we have 12 kinds because we are in hollows, and there are more speciation inside these little canyons, these hollows. And the same thing with up north, they had a glacier. The glacier didn't come down. And so that meant in many of these places, you know, there are people still getting their supplies by mules because there was only one road. And then they put in bridges, and look, half a dozen of these new bridges have fallen out because the land has been scoured and nothing holds the soil. So really active cutting edge composting, bioremediation, and bioremediation is the technology that we're bringing more people in about than anything else. I don't know that any place has been scoured like that where people live so much. You know, there's parts, it's like the middle part of Washington State, but it's also where you live. It's, you know, and so it's, I think texts, Facebook, Starlink, and the microgrids that brought, you know, connectivity to folks who were not able to, you know, we didn't have cell power for weeks. So, you know, microgrids got people able to text using Starlink.
Are there any other questions in the room?
In your first answer, you sort of offhand it, the county was not on your part of the team, on your side, and as someone who's involved in local government, it just seems that local government would have to be a part of this transformation.
Yes.
And if that incident wasn't enough to bring local governments to see this perspective, or see this potential, or see this opportunity, or recognize this need for these changes to be able to establish these networks and this system of interacting with people economically. Well, what's the threshold of urgency, or does that can do that?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's in all these books I read, there's also a book, Black Wave and Heat Wave, and Solnit's book, and The Unthinkable. And they say the first responders are almost never the government. It's the people around you are the first responders. And by not having government come in and take people out of power, which all these places that Black Wave and Heat Wave are about how government failed, we were able to go a lot further. Obviously now we need more. The governor does listen to us. Now that we become on the front page of the New York Times, everybody wants to help us. But there'd been a habit for 100 years of paying no attention. You know, if you want to do cost cutting, take it from Swannanoa. We had no voice. We realized that we need a citizen advocacy group, which our county commissioner, who's a much better than average county commissioner, Terry Wells, was able to do. But she was new and didn't have historical clout in the county. She got them to pause and study the library, but it's still their plan. So we need, and there'd never been citizen advocacy for Swannanoa. There was, you know, it's like I was working with a black woman who's doing a mesh network in Louisiana, and they discovered they needed the mesh network during the pandemic because they couldn't get their homework. She says, you know, I'm a black woman in rural Louisiana, and I usually take what I'm given, but we rose up and said we needed a mesh network. Swannanoa had internalized oppression, and nobody had ever spoken up for Swannanoa. So I think government is listening to us now because people, I have some status, everybody else has some status. We're now combining as a group for us to be listened to. The group that we're combining under, acting like a backbone organization. And a backbone organization is key. So there's lots of nonprofits and they typically compete. Swannanoa Grassroots Alliance is not another competing nonprofit, but they're a coordinating group. And there's a model for that in our county called French Broad River Alliance. And that keeps the big competing nonprofits talking to each other and not competing. So you need a backbone organization that is not a nonprofit that can get the nonprofits together and talk to community groups. But nobody had ever asked Swannanoa. When they wanted to close our library a year and a half ago, they just sent an email to the librarian saying, we're closing end of the month, we'll move you somewhere else. And so we had never spoken up and we never realized we have some power. So I think citizen power can talk to government. But government had a habit of paying no attention to Swannanoa, and we had a habit of paying no attention to Swannanoa. So government is key now. The fact that the governor talked to us, and then we were the one that got the governor to make FEMA's vouchers last for the whole county. So we're the first call for the governor, because the governor knows when he shows up in Swannanoa, all the cameras want to be there because it's a picture of devastation. So we're turning our picture of devastation into a branding opportunity and therefore some political power. We did not want to be ignored, but we had a habit of it and we took it until, we suddenly stood up and said, no, we are somebody.
You have a question for you?
I was curious. I know your work has been in Swannanoa, and your lived experiences in this area. I'm also from North Carolina, and I feel like I have kind of felt and understood that specifically in Swannanoa or areas around Asheville, in part mutual aid was so successful because a lot of these folks don't necessarily have an infrastructure or a space where that community was kind of built in. I would argue lots of folks are non-religious, lots of folks are queer. It's a very liberal city in that way, and I think in some ways there are already these groups of support that folks would lean on. So I'm curious if, kind of in doing this work, you have looped in with any communities in LA and kind of in that wildfire, because I feel like I haven't necessarily felt that same response or that same message that I had from the hurricane response.
We still don't have so much. And there are people who still need cash disbursements. There are still people that, still hundreds in hotels with no place to go. And then there are folks, who need propane brought to them in their campers that they're camping on now. We haven't looked anywhere else because it's still really hard. One church really stands out that's kind of interesting, Grace Covenant in Asheville. They've been a channel for more than $2 million around housing. In fact, the city, which is not the most effectively governed, has given them $475,000 of federal money that came in to work on housing because they realize Grace Covenant, which had a justice minister ahead of time and knew where the money should go, is a much more effective aid provider than the city is itself. A lot of times ineffective governments don't give money, but everybody realized that they'd already raised $2 million before the county or the city gave them $475,000. So, our county is not the smartest in the world, but they're not dysfunctional. The city has had, I think, 4 DEI folks in 5 years. That tells you a lot about who they are and who they aren't. So, in some places, faith groups can be the way to scale an initiative that a local government can't. You don't see that often, but sometimes they really know where people are. When I had a truck come in the first week or so, first week, somebody was saying, I'm bringing a truck, where should I go? And I called our county commissioner, and she said, go to Grovemont. Grovemont has the public library, and it has summer movies for the kids in the park. They're the only place that has a park. And then there is a dance they have. So they knew where the babies were, they knew where the shut-ins were, where so many other groups had diapers on the highway, come get them. So the social capital you build before a disaster really makes everybody safer. And so that's one of the things we really learned. And you know, we know where the shut-ins are, we know where the babies are now, but in many places we didn't know that. I think social capital to know the needs of your neighbor will make everybody safer when the disaster happens. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room?
I just wanted to say one quick thing about LA, and that is that so there's two major communities that burn: Pacific Palisades, which is full of celebrities and very rich
Right.
people and all that, and Altadena, which is a lovely middle class neighborhood, like 60% black. And where the organization happened was in Altadena. That they got, like, you know, the diapers reminded me. So just a group of neighbors went to the Santa Anita racetrack and said, bring stuff, and they just got so much stuff. And you didn't hear, they didn't do that in Malibu. You know?
Right.
So it's just kind of interesting point of information, but also that because it's a big city, they really expect government to come in and do something.
Right.
Whereas you actually had that advantage, weirdly enough, that you didn't expect anybody. So I just wanted to.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about LA in this context, but it's so much with, you know, just Asheville, but it's so related because we're
Right.
really talking about the same concept.
Right.
Thanks for bringing that up.
And with that, all four of the books that I've been reading, the biggest problem is that the folks planning to respond to the disaster don't give a role to the local people to lead, because they will be the ones on the scene, and then the firemen will come in day 2 or whatever. You know, the FEMA rescue folks. You know, they came 3 days later, got us to our farm, but your neighbors are there first, and so you have to build in ad hoc, informal citizen response and tell them things, you know, and so many of these things, they don't think they can handle it, and so they don't tell them the truth. You know, you have to tell the truth to the folks impacted and be willing for them to be the people in the place are the first responders. In all the books, they say that's one of the things that's not built in. They assume that the authorities will respond. The authorities will follow. Your neighbors will lead.
Any other questions in the room? I think we have time for a few more. I can check the chat real quick.
I've been asking it, I don't see it. I don't see it.
Let me double check real quick. Looks like no questions in the chat.
Yeah. I think we're good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for asking me.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have more questions in my head, but we can talk about it. And this is Steve here is putting together the video for this. This will be online. It'll be at YouTube. It'll be more audible than it was here, thanks to where we're coming from. So
Yeah.
thanks again.
Yeah, and I think your question, there should be a kit that brings innovative finance along with disaster relief. And because they're new things these tools can do, but they haven't been applied.
Like the mesh network goes in the kit.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.